É um prazer receber aqui no estúdio Oswaldo Porchat, da Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da USP, o professor Abdulmalik Simon, professor Abdulmalik Simon, que nós vamos falar um pouco sobre a obra dele, uma autoridade, um especialista em estudos urbanos, com destaque mais recentemente para a abordagem das chamadas urbanidades negras, Black Urbanities, e para fazer esse encontro, essa troca de impressões e de reflexões a respeito desse tema, mas, enfim, também pensando nos estudos urbanos, nós aqui, eu, a professora Fraia Freza, né, justamente professora associada do Departamento de Sociologia, me junto aqui à professora Laura Kemmer, que é a professora titular da Cátedra Márcios de Estudos sobre Sustentabilidade da Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da USP e que está ligada ao Departamento de Sociologia da USP, a professora Laura Kemmer, e a estudante de graduação Carolina Lima, que está estudando Ciências Sociais aqui na USP, na FEFELESH, na Faculdade de Filosofia, e que também coopera e tem, enfim, se engajado em estágios e trabalhos no Departamento de Sociologia. Então, é um grande prazer para nós recebermos o professor Abdulmalik. Ele está no Brasil, ele veio para cá, na verdade, no âmbito de um projeto mais amplo que ele está coordenando na Universidade Federal da Bahia, e veio para a USP pela primeira vez no contexto da chamada Winter School FEFELESH 2025, que eu e a professora Laura Moutinho, presidente e vice-presidente da CCINT, ou vice-presidente, professora Laura, presidente, coordenamos aqui na USP, e em particular na nossa FEFELESH, em agosto de 2025, e foi nesse contexto que o professor Malik veio para São Paulo pela primeira vez, e aí esteve conosco ministrando um curso sobre as Black Urbanities. Nesse contexto, ele também veio fazer uma palestra no Departamento de Sociologia da USP sobre esse tema, e na ocasião nós o convidamos para que numa próxima vinda dele a São Paulo, que ele se dispusesse a ser entrevistado por nós três, e ele topou na sua vinda atual para cá, e eis então que conseguimos fazer esse encontro. Para fins da nossa conversa aqui, nós vamos fazer a entrevista com ele em inglês, né? A proposta é que essa entrevista seja um videocast, mas que também posteriormente saia publicada na sua forma transcrita e editada numa das revistas, enfim, num dos periódicos científicos brasileiros e, quem sabe, aqui da própria USP. Então, nós começamos a entrevista que nós organizamos, o professor Malik já está sabendo, o nosso roteiro de entrevistas inclui 3 blocos, né, de temas. O primeiro, na verdade, diz respeito ao papel dessa abordagem dele sobre as Black Urbanities na história urbana pessoal do professor Malik. O professor Malik, ele é um pesquisador, né, que viajou e viaja muito pelos 4 cantos do mundo, vive em Jacarta, na Indonésia, já há muito tempo, mas nasceu nos Estados Unidos, trabalha tem fortes vínculos institucionais com a Universidade de Sheffield, na Inglaterra, mas também com a África do Sul, enfim, zanzou e zanza muito pelo mundo. Então, nós achamos que seria interessante, no primeiro momento, entender como essa abordagem dele sobre as urbanidades negras se insere na sua própria história urbana pessoal. Num segundo momento, a gente vai falar do papel de Black Urbanities na obra dele, e num terceiro momento, com base na experiência que ele, a essa altura, afinal de contas, chegou em maio em Salvador e está vivendo lá em Salvador desde então, e passando também por São Paulo e outras cidades do Brasil, e vai ficar aqui até novembro. Nós achamos que poderia ser interessante questioná-lo também sobre o papel dessa abordagem dele sobre as Black Urbanities nas metrópoles brasileiras contemporâneas. Então é isso, e vamos então começar com I'm switching into English, Malik, in order to welcome you at our Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas, again, né? And by actually, you know, the interview script, but we would like to start by asking you, né, to, if possible, né, to help us list in a chronological order all the cities you have lived by now, say for at least a whole month, let's say that, ne? And based on that list, ne, we would like to address a bit about the relationship of your everyday life in these cities, with the development of this approach to black urbanities and so on. How you would locate in your own urban story or history this development of this concept and research on that. Ne? So, would you start by saying, could you list all the cities you have been living by now for at least a month? At least for a month.
Freetown, Chicago, New York, Algiers, Kai, Bamako, Abidjan, Accra, Dakar, Khartoum, Dar es Salaam, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Douala, Kinshasa, Jakarta, Phnom Penh, Bangkok. Oh, Berlin, Berlin, London, um, Paris,
Like,
Salvador.
Okay.
Oh, Los Angeles, San Francisco.
Oh, but this is an amazing list. Not only the list is quantitatively very broad, but what amazed me was the way you only remembered that you've been in the global north after the beginning, the start of your life, much later on in your list. How would you how do you assess this kind of that from your heart, when you are asked that the first titles were all located in what we use very, very incorrectly, but nevertheless, let's use it as to locate in the global south, no? This kind of. You only
Well,
remember the north.
because in some sense I spent the first 14 years of my life growing up in Freetown, so one's affective inclinations are shaped largely through one's childhood and childhood archives and imaginations. Um, but at the same time, I'm very much, if someone asks me where I, maybe not so much at this moment in history, but where I felt a sense of home to be located, I, up until recently, would have said Brooklyn. Um, I feel very identified with the notion of Brooklyn. So it's the South is not something that adheres to a specific geographical attribution or divide.
What is the south for you?
The South, well, the South is many different things. The South is in some ways the world of blackness. Uh, is the world of Islam, is the world of animism, it's the world of Sufi, it's the world of the world of conquest, the world of remainders, the world of circumvention. It's the world yet to come. It's the world that will never come.
Hmm. And how would you say, because the second question is actually this, regarding your everyday, how you would describe your everyday life in the cities. And so how can you just try to sum up a bit? Because we actually would like to, because we wanted to address the links between your everyday life in these cities and this development of your approach to life in these cities and to cities in general, which always tries to address and to explore this this B side of everything. So it's more about the what Lefebvre would call the residues. So it's always something that I will not say informality, but it's always some. It's a very sensitive way of addressing what has not been written, what has not been addressed by words, by texts, and so on, by rationality, by plan, and so. So we were wondering actually whether you could address a bit more or think a bit about how your everyday life may have or may influence this way of developing or the way you look at cities, or doesn't it have anything to do with everyday life in the cities or your everyday
No,
life?
I mean you make of what you are availed, you make of what you can, uh, and you learn to roll with the different kinds of rhythms that each particular context has to offer. Um, I mean, I've been fortunate not to have to inhabit most of the places that I've lived within a kind of strict or rigid modality. You know, there have been times when I've been in exile. There have been times when I do smuggling. There's times when I'm in the classroom as a professor. There's times when I'm a lover in residence. There's times when I'm an advocate. Uh, there's times where I'm a representative of an international organization. There are so it's it. There are times when I work with community-based organizations, NGOs. Um, so all of those different activities have their own places and their own surroundings and their own networks. Uh, and so that allows a kind of multiplicity of positions and angles on which to view ways in which cities are elaborated and lived.
Well, how would you, given that we are here at a university, how would you um, if you can delve a little bit more into this academic way of being in cities, né? Or scientifically, this everyday life of an academic, né? Because I know we know that you are now you have this activist and transdisciplinary uh, way of being and of living in cities, but um, I guess that the academic stance, né, or a scholarly stance is the basis of at least institutional basis, or wouldn't you agree that it has been of all of this list you showed us that the majority of your presence, as it were, or stays in these cities have been mediated by your role as an academic or not?
In most instances, yes,
And
but not always. And even if that were the case, you know, you live in cities and you work for universities where at times university is closed for the year for political reasons, or the faculty is on strike, or the students are on strike, or there's been a coup d'état, and and even in those instances, one is forced to stretch the notions of what academia might might mean. And it's in those instances that have been in some ways more oftentimes more productive. Um, because particularly, you know, back you know some decades ago, many universities you wouldn't even find chalk, you know, to
yes,
write on the blackboard. The libraries didn't have journals that were, current for many decades. But there was somehow an impetus on the part of some, not all students, to explore and to invent different kinds of practices and ways of exploring that in some ways took the university out into sort of unknown terrain with interesting collaborations. So yeah, and then I've worked for institutions that are full of money, um, where yeah, you can do basically anything you want, except anything that you want falls oftentimes within very strict bureaucratic parameters. So maybe not that much gets done that is very interesting.
Hmm. And where were you living? In which city were you living when you decided to really um, to develop this Black Urbanities approach? Do you remember when it where you were when you started to say, "Wow, I want to write more about this. I want to reflect more upon this issue."
No, I mean for me it started when I was sort of 9 and 10, when my paternal grandmother, who already lived in Chicago, uh, marched in civil rights demonstrations as the only white woman in a neighborhood of Chicago that was completely racist. Um, and some for very early on, I was really in somehow concerned to commit sort of my intellectual resources to thinking about thinking about racism and thinking about uh, I mean when I grew up in an African city, as the my brother and I were the only white kids in our neighborhood, um, and every summer we were sent to my mother's father, my grandfather, who was an immigrant in Detroit, who went to sleep very early, and my brother and I would sneak out and roam the streets of Detroit at night. And so living in going in back and forth between two very different cities with a majority of black inhabitants,
Hmm.
and as white kids, trying to find our way through these kinds of worlds. Um, it was a matter of this is what we were given.
Hmm.
This is where we were situated, and how to make something of that.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, maybe to address the tenor of your question more directly is that I I have spent almost the entirety of my life working within uh, majority black urban contexts. Um, I worked for 10 years at a university, what they call a historically black college.
Hmm.
Um,
How
and
which was it? What's
Medgar Evers College, which was part of the City University of New York
okay?
in Brooklyn. Um, and and so if you do urban work, um, you have to do that urban work in the context in which you find yourself.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I think that in the last Yeah, so I mean, I wrote a book in 1980 something. I don't even remember the title of it. It was the first book I wrote, and it was about sort of black epistemologies in urban America. Um, but I think that it's been primarily in the last 20 years where I have, with others, tried to work through this notion of blackness as a method for thinking about urban history, urban processes. Um,
Hmm. And this, just last one. And this, where did you study? At which university did you make when you, because you grew up in Chicago and in this area, Chicago, and always going to
yeah, I
region.
mean, I have very limited formal education. I was a high school dropout after 1 year. Um, I dropped out of college after 1 year. Um, I finished my BA degree at a sort of special adult school in New York. Then I got a opportunity to study in the 1970s during the burst of alternative education
Wow,
at an alternative PhD program in Berkeley.
Mhm.
amazing. Wow, this.
So I have a very impoverished formal education, but the thing about the where I went to do my PhD is that it allowed me to move around, and so I worked with a lot of really very interesting, primarily French philosophers who were in residence in San Diego and at UCLA. So I had a chance to be exposed and work with Derrida and Foucault and Guattari, and so this kind of sort of European-based political philosophy was
Hmm.
always something very important in terms of my thinking.
And the PhD was in which area? Was there
It
a
was in
specific?
something called clinical and social psychology.
Wow.
So I for some years worked as a clinician, as a clinical psychologist.
Wow, Malik.
I was
100 lives, 100 lives.
I was a clinical director of a psychiatric ward for intensive care unit for a state psychiatric hospital in Staten Island for a couple of years, and yeah, and then I
Mm-hmm.
détourné.
Uh-huh. Amazing. This was now the first block. I would only suggest to bring, yeah, the microphone near.
Mhm.
Then let's try this.
Let's continue. Yes. So we continue in the chronology, although I think your last point on having this encounters with the French philosophers and also working as a professional in the field of clinical psychiatry will bring us back in the third block. We will talk about um, Deleuze and Glissant and some of the concepts in there as well. And there is a current exhibition which we might even mention in the Instituto Tomio Otake about Glissant, which brings me to a question about why is Glissant so much discussed these days, not only in your work but also in Brazil. But let's take one step back and
Mm-hmm.
get to our questions about your work, because you said you wrote a book back in the 80s where you were already thinking about blackness as a fundamental concept, but then you have been working in the field of urban studies a lot, of course, and contributing. So you're also positioning with these other scholars you're working with Black urbanities as a fundamental concept for urban studies. And we wanted to retrace this a little bit through your work. So
Mm-hmm.
looking at the last 20 years rather, asking, so what happened between, let's say, city life from Jakarta to Dakar, improvised lives, rhythms of endurance in an urban south, and the latest, The Surrounds. So what happened in between these books?
Mm-hmm.
How did you shape your interest in the urban through these books? Um, how have you made some observations through these books? How have these also provoked you to rethink stuff, to further develop certain ideas, discard others? So we would like to ask you to give some examples of how throughout these three books or throughout these past 20 years, you have been shaping your thoughts on urban studies and by this also the concept of Black urbanities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that if there's been a movement, it's been away from a certain kind of ethnographic
Mhm.
preoccupation to revalorize the ways in which Black inhabitants of particular urban contexts generate uh, singular, viable modalities of livelihood and of endurance and of politics to a more onto epistemological preoccupation with the way in which blackness is engaged or not engaged philosophically by uh, explorations of the urban.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, particularly in terms of the move away from the notion of the city as embodying urbanization
Mm-hmm.
processes, and the way in which this coincides with the way in which this coincides with sort of attempt to dissolve the tyranny of the set. The tyranny of the set being that which is in some ways all inclusive of the Earth's heterogeneities. Because after all, you know, the logic of the imperial of imperial practice of imperialism is an inclusive one. It is the violent instantiation of a set that includes everyone.
You say said
Set,
s
set,
a set,
the
a set.
set, yeah,
Okay, the set.
the
Mhm.
set
Okay.
that includes everyone,
Mhm.
not as equal citizens, but it includes everyone as implicated, everyone as participants.
Mhm.
So how do you get around that? How do you circumvent that? And that's why methodologically, blackness might be useful given its positionality
Mhm.
as always indeterminately both lesser and excessive
Mhm.
to interrogate the set of the city or the
Mm-hmm.
set of the urban.
Mhm.
So if blackness is always simultaneously something lesser and something more, then how do you think, how do you deploy blackness as a method to explore that which is not quite the city,
Mhm.
not quite the urban, not quite the set,
Mm-hmm.
and something that is excessive
Mhm.
of the set, something that is more than that. And then that then has led to a series of investigations with different set of
Mhm.
participants in different collectives,
Mhm.
which think of the not quite
Mhm.
as as if the not quite, for example, as the exploration of arrangements and rearrangements. all of those sort of processes of tacit collectivization, of acting in concert, of gathering up, of orchestrating, of choreographies
Mhm.
that are not quite those of the institution. They're not quite the of, of discernible uh, institutional life. You know, it's not the family, it's not the state, it's not the organization, it's not the
Mm.
school, it's not the church, it's not the household.
Mhm.
But there are modes of there are arrangements, and these arrangements are always on the cusp of rearrangements. So this is in some sense not quite the set
Mhm.
of the urban. And then in other explorations with again people that change, you know, this has involved maybe 60, 70 people over the past couple of years. The excessive, the beyond, is the notion of extensions.
Mm.
And here, this can coincide with notions of extended urbanization,
Mhm.
but only partly. We draw extensions in even a larger framework. So the extensions being the the notion of having agency beyond the confines of the individual subject. It's not the white body, it's not the tyranny of the individual set
Mm.
of the integrity and the
Mm.
coherence of the individual, but something that is more distributed, something that's more ephemeral, something which in sort of some segments of black philosophy is designated as enfleshment. Um, and so using this notion of extensions is something that in some ways goes beyond the set of the urban.
Mhm.
So this is just an example of the way in which some of us are preoccupied with moving sort of beyond the ethnographic investigations of how blackness is manifested empirically within particular settings and think about its onto insinuation in the world
Mm.
as a kind of method to try to think of the urban in other ways.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And then therefore this is then, you know, the way in which these alignments in some sense with Glissant and
Mm.
others become important.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I will still come to two or three of the concepts that we found interesting in this work I have just cited from your work, in dialogue with the concept of Black urbanities,
Mhm.
because we have been discussing a little bit this idea, and I was also provoked by you now saying that I understand there is a shift in focus, let's say, from an empirical interest towards an ontological positioning also of Black urbanities and also methodology that comes with it. Then the question is, does this mean, what does it mean for your notion of endurance, for
Mhm.
instance, in your work? Because in a recent piece, for instance, that we have been discussing, you have this idea of enduring the city requires never taking oneself or anyone else seriously, if only to supplement everyday transactions with small surfeits of negotiability. I call this a way of standing by the promise, which is also something that we have been discussing
Yeah.
back in Berlin. But the question is, so how does this description of the endurance that you
Mhm.
posit here, and that has a lot of to do with being indifferent. It's not, maybe not opacity in this sense, but there is something that I see as continuous in your thoughts. So how
Mhm.
would you link this your notion of endurance in this sense to a discussion on black urbanities? Is there any connection between these two?
I mean, in the book Improvised Lives, I take this notion that Catherine McKittrick uh, introduced on uninhabitability, but
Mm-hmm.
I kind of twist it in a way, and the twist is misunderstood by a lot of people who continue to want to think about uninhabitability as somehow, there's like it's really bad conditions that people
Mm-hmm.
face, and it's yeah, it makes habitation it makes it uninhabitable because things are so fucked up. But it's not what I meant by this. For me, uninhabitability is in some ways that the the elaboration of the urban puts into operations different kinds of materialities, different kinds of technicities, with technicities having a sort of strata of their own, uh, separate from the social, and that there are heterogeneous forces and agencies at work that themselves are indifferent to human life.
Mm-hmm.
They are not at the service of human survival or sustainability or endurance. They are indifferent to it. And so endurance in some ways is a kind of orientation which is in some ways not indifferent to that indifference, but in somehow recognizes that indifference as a kind of as a kind of reality, um, that in some sense undermines or obviates the need to always lead one's life as a way of protecting one's attainments,
Yeah.
to defend the integrity of one's life project, to defend the integrity of one's self subjectification. And that endurance in some ways means that one has to continuously rediscover the possibilities of living through particular kinds of practices and orientations that may be totally unrecognizable in terms of what one thought one was.
Yeah, let me just add a bit because here in Brazil, one of your interviews, now the only interview of yours with you, which has been translated into Portuguese, translates indeed endurance as resistência, resistance. You would not. Or how do you think? Because when I myself was there trying for example, convey in Portuguese what endurance means, né? In my opinion, persistência, is something more. It is nearer to what you mean by endurance than resistance, because resistance, the presupposition is that you have a kind of let's try to as if there was a kind of Foucaultian rational né? And I don't think you conceive it in resistance terms. Would you say that, or how do you?
No, I wouldn't want to minimize the importance of resistance as a strategic practice, but endurance is not subsumed by
Mm-hmm.
practices of resistance. Resistance may be part of a toolbox, um, but endurance is to endure means at times to let go, to move on,
Mm-hmm.
to know when to exit strategically, to know when to dissimulate,
Mm-hmm.
uh, to know how to submit. These are all performative grammars anyway,
Yeah.
to be used tactically. But I think philosophically, it is the notion of endurance is the recognition that we live in a world where there are many forces and agencies that are indifferent to our existence and whatever we make of that. So, how does one live within
Mm-hmm.
that indifference?
Mhm.
Is to me the sort of challenge of not challenge the the obligation of endurance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would really say it's close to what we have been. If you think of a Brazilian context, when Malik and I developed this paper on standing by the promise, we were discussing an expression in Brazilian Portuguese, which is ficar com a promessa, ficou
Yeah,
na promessa.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this idea of standing by as something that is on hold also, which is about exactly not this running behind the eternal promise of the cities, trying to achieve something on this linearity of progress,
Mm-hmm.
of self fulfillment, and so on, but really um, to endure in this sense of standing by, of holding on, of keeping with in a sense, but also letting loose and staying indifferent to these processes. This is something that actually I wanted to link this question and maybe then also lead over to the third part of our
Yes.
interview and to the questions, because we also had this question about your notion of the uninhabitable, of habitability, uninhabitability, and I think you explained it very well now in relation to endurance. And you also refer to it when you talk about blackness, or rather, you talk about whiteness and how this idea of the individual inhabitant of the city is somehow discentered also by this idea of uninhabitability, and consequently also of blackness, right? So I think this was a question that might lead over to this our of us delving into the question of black urbanities. If you could say something about how this way of thinking beyond inhabitation is also linked to a notion of black urbanities.
In the sense that I mean there of course are in terms of black urbanities, one can approach it through a an always substantiated, elongated archive of 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 practices, of histories, of ontologies, of attainments, of resistances, of defeats, of and that archive, of course, is important. Um, so all the valorizations of Black life, its texts, its memories, its oralities, its symbols, its all of this is important. But there's another aspect which is to some of us uh, also important, which is the 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 elaboration of a surface, of a way of seeing, of a way of moving, of a way of navigating. Because how does one move? One moves on a surface. Um, if you look at the auto construction of many popular territories,
Mm-hmm.
what is striking is you can do a genealogy about how those popular territories came about, but that genealogy doesn't address the 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 actualities of what the surface does. All of the different kinds of pathways and circuits and
Mm-hmm.
shadows and apertures and curves and all of the navigations that take place and the kinds of interactions and the cycles and circulations of bodies and things that it takes place on that surface. And and in a world where uh, black inhabitants have been suppressed and constrained, violated, um, the exigency has always been to move because capture always necessitates some kind of movement, even within very limited physical spaces. So what I'm saying is that it is the composition of this surface
Mm-hmm.
that is important. So when, for example, when the 5 percenters, this kind of, I don't know what to call them, a kind of gang, religious group, entrepreneurial organization in the US that was, during the 80s, 70s, 80s, of which Wu Tang Clan was the sort of most famous exemplar of. When they talk about what is blackness, they talk specifically about the composition of a surface. All of the words that get used, all of the food that gets brought to different kitchens, all of the handshakes, all of the recognitions on the street, all of the gospel singing in the church, all of it is you use everything to create a kind of surface of navigation, a surface of movement. And it is the surface which is blackness. It is not the description of the individual. It is not the description of the surface of the skin, but the surface of a certain
Mm-hmm.
of a
The
endless and
traces.
mutable circumnavigation.
Mm-hmm.
So Glissant talks about a very particular kind of surfacing, an elaboration of a surface, which is always one of fragments,
Mm-hmm.
because there is no cohesive
Mm-hmm.
embodiment of the thing itself. The thing enters the world broken. Blackness enters the world broken. It is to be that which is broken. And therefore, that brokenness becomes the very occasion for, because something broken, you have to go from here to here.
Mm-hmm.
There's no
Bridge,
there's no
no
suture,
passage.
there's no,
Mm.
Yeah.
so you have to invent that. It is a leap. It is
Mm-hmm.
Fanon's leap when he talks about invention.
Mm-hmm.
So the invention, Fanon wasn't so much interested in the development of a new genealogy. He wasn't interested in the invention of a new black psyche. What he was interested in was the invention of a new way for black people to navigate the world.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Mhm. Good.
So now you're gonna do the block 3, and it's the last one. So my first question is, it's about art. So in your talks during the winter school, you have referenced a lot of black artists that I which sparked great interest in me, and such as Atur Jaffa, Zanil Muhal, John Aconfirm. And in this dialogue between art and the city, how do you see the role of art in shaping Black urbanity? And from your recent experience at the current International Art Biennial of this year in São Paulo, can you say anything in particular? And because I remember that you told me about the majority of Black artists in the art biennial. So I would like to hear about that.
Okay, I'm gonna have a different take on this. I'm gonna I'm gonna I mean there's a lot of really interesting work about the generation of a black aesthetic or black artistic practice, whatever you want to call it.
Literature as well.
Yeah. But I mean I'm not sure what the curational team for the Biennale was up to. Um, but I take like if you so you go to the Biennale and you look and you see, you watch, it's not, I mean, of course it's a sensory experience in many ways, but it still is primarily visual.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of seeing. So look at what machine learning does. What machine learning does is it takes images and it breaks them down into not only pixels but even more subparticles than pixels, and it takes those and it intersects them with thousands and thousands of other images similarly deconstructed in the typical, not the Derridan sense, but the typical
Mm-hmm.
notion of that. And it generates a whole different way of seeing that is not based on our it is not based on our cognitive processing, human cognitive processing capacities.
Mm-hmm.
It generates something that's totally something else. So I would like to use that as a metaphor then for, in a way, what 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 I'm interested in using these images for, which is maybe a different way of seeing. Uh, of course, now we're doing it as in terms of our human perceptual framework and capacities, but somehow to spur a different kind of a different kind of sensibility, something that more textual, analytical stuff wouldn't be able to do. So one could go through the Biennale and think of it as a kind of black algorithm in some ways. Um, and again, in fact, there are many pieces there where what's presented is a particular arrangement of fragments of objects, materials, things that get produced, film clips, T-shirts, sounds, things that are assembled, uh, that they don't lose their fragmentary quality,
Mm-hmm.
but they now are pieced together, rearranged, not as a final destination, not as a final destination,
Mm.
but something that continues to be able to move on.
Mm.
Um, okay, politically, it's particularly now in this context of really intensified global anti-blackness, to have such a biennale where there is hardly any white representatives is a resounding declaration
Mm.
of the insistence upon a particular way of continuing to pay attention to the world as it is and might and could be.
Mhm.
And I think that, for me, the presentation of image with text is a different track, and that track has its own life in some ways, and somehow the relationship between the text and the image, people ask me, well, we don't get that the image isn't exemplifying the text, and that's exactly the point. It's not there to exemplify
Mhm.
the text. It's to have this sense that there's something else besides.
Mhm.
And that something else besides is in both senses. It's next to each other,
Mhm.
but it's something that's besides.
Yeah.
But if you're going to take the notion of alternative, it's an alternative not freed from that proximity of what it's next to.
Mhm.
It is always going to be besides that. So one can't think of a kind of different sensibility autonomous and separate from that which it is always in some sense next to.
Mm.
And in some ways, that's the point I'm trying to make through the use of images
Mhm.
in the teaching, those slides.
Mhm.
So, beyond the visual arts, you also recommended some films along with the course. Yeah, one of them was the 2019
Yes.
Les Miserables, and which portrays violence in a commune in France. Although the story is set in France, there are similar tensions in São Paulo and in Brazil more broadly, which highlights the Black experience as one of that transcends geographical boundaries. How do you view these experiences? And in what ways do these tensions and struggles reflect patterns of urban experience?
I mean, in the film, the point of the film, Lee's film, in about the place he grew up, basically,
Mhm.
is that part of the reason for the design of these social housing projects was as a kind of disciplinary maneuver. Um, that is, you organize these bodies into uh, into forms, into figurations that are disciplinary, uh, that undermine and really curtail the capacity of the residents to be able to generate ways of urban living and appropriation that are autonomous from the from the function to which they have been designated, which is either as a subaltern labor force or a labor force in waiting, um, with also the assumption that, I mean, in terms of, again, the imperial impetus, the imperial impetus was the readability of the world. That is,
Mhm.
you're not so much interested in getting people to do what it is to become who you are, but to make everyone readable, legible. And so these social housing projects are acts of enforced legibility. But in reality, the residents of that particular district in Paris took what those constraints were and refigured them. That is, walls were often torn down to make, conjoint living spaces between contiguous apartments. There were all kinds of reciprocities. Of course, people had connections to places far beyond Paris. There were diasporic economies of, um, they were not readable in the way in which the police were supposed to be able to find them.
Mhm.
And so there's always this kind of then tension. Um, and game, because in some ways residents dissimulate. They
Yes.
act as if there's a certain kind of reality that takes place in order to protect things that otherwise might leave them vulnerable to even more intensive incursions
Mhm.
by housing managers, social workers. So there's also a game there.
Mhm.
So in some ways, these are carceral places, um, but in ways in which so that's the dilemma in some ways. How do you think about them? How do you engage them as both places of carcerality and again something else that remains uncolonized, undisciplined, um, and the way in which the attributions of criminality and violence, where that criminality and violence is in some ways actively cultivated by biopolitics as the only option in which to generate resources, but then become the occasion through which uh, the police can and others can kill, can constrain, can undermine, can control.
Mhm. Yes, so given this context, and I don't know, I think that you talked about it, but how do you see the proximity between death and life in Black community and in all these violences that they live, the proximity of being being alive and being so close to death?
In Brazil,
In
in
Brazil, yeah,
urban experiences in Brazil.
yes.
Yes.
É isso? Because it's né?
Yeah.
Precisely because. And how would you frame this fact, which is actually this proximity between life and death in Black urban experience in Brazil? How would you frame it with the help of Black urbanities, for example, and all this approach?
I mean, if you look at a place like Salvador, for example, I mean, it's a black majority city demographically, but it is a white city economically and politically. That despite that over the course of 60 years, self-produced black popular territories were able to do an enormous work in providing uh, providing viable residency to a large number of people. I mean, when you think of 1960s, in places like Tancredo Neves or in Nordeste, Amarillo, 1960s, 1% of the territory was occupied. In 60 years, 100%. There's not an inch left where there is not an enormous attainment. Now, how did that come about? Well, it's the self-production is not necessarily the materiality. It's not just the built environment. It's the self-production of a sociality that, okay, had certain antecedents to draw upon. It had the memory and the experience of the Quilombo. It had particular kinds of Afro-religious symbols and practices and archives and memories to draw upon. But it's basically the self-production of territory that that was accomplished through simply the practice of sharing. So the household, the street, can't be categorized in terms of public and private. It's all in some ways continuously to rearrange itself, to shift. That whatever was produced, self-produced, didn't fit the kind of normative categories through which the normative sociological categories, the household, the institution, the association. It was the capacity to produce. What is the object of the assault is not necessarily the product of self-production, but the capacity to continue to produce. That is the very life-making generative capacities of Black inhabitants to continue to produce a kind of viable modalities of residence capable of always readapting to the shifting urban conditions. This is where a kind of necropolitic comes in. It's not just that the police are there to, in some ways, to do these performative shows of killing residents, or of preventing gatherings, from samba gatherings to any kind of social life on Sundays to barbecue. And it's not just the interdiction. It is the curtailment of the capacity to produce life. And therefore, the notion of death is not just in terms of police killing, but it is the assault on the very self-producing capacities of inhabitants to, and therefore, this kind of assault on the very act of social reproduction and the way in which it undermines the sense of the generativity of a sense of collective life. So people find themselves fragmented, having to do stuff on their own, to valorize the sense of well-being in terms of, I'm gonna get paid, I'm gonna get paid, and I'm gonna get paid no matter what, and I don't give about whether or not I'm gonna get paid. So these kinds of vernaculars, which are increasingly globalized, as the declaration of eligibility, regardless, without a kind of collective foundation project underneath.
Given that you were talking about Salvador, we included a question here regarding São Paulo. You once wrote to me that São Paulo is one of the most engaging cities you've ever been, one of the world's most engaging places by far. Why do you say that? Why do you think São Paulo is like this? What makes São Paulo this place?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know very much about Sao Paulo, but I've been told in some ways that the political project of Sao Paulo atrophies in many ways, that many neighborhood associations face increased difficulties in terms of sustaining themselves. The larger urban politics is calcified in some ways, repressive in other ways, antediluvian in other respects, and that it is on the cultural level that things are able to take place, and that there's a proliferation of all different kinds of different kinds of small projects, undertaken by different people, different actors, from the rich to the poor, from the, um, I mean, I found over the past few days, we found ourselves in some places which, is like completely, is a completely, these are completely sort of self-contained rituals with their own codes, their own uniforms, their own people arriving from all over the city, like city, into a place where
Yeah.
none of them live. You'd think you never find this kind of thing taking place on this street,
Together.
and it's taking place in this street. On the other hand, you find things taking place in the periphery, which you never thought would take place in the periphery, but yet it's taking place in the periphery amongst people you never thought would be in the periphery. So there is an
It's a
intense
collage, né? It's a kind of,
there's an intense territorialization here, intense territorialization in niches and segmentations and apartheids. But there's also this kind of subterranean, rhizomatic, weird, strange hybridization of crowds and players and
That's true.
and I don't know what to make of this. I'm just a tangential visitor here, but it's I'm endlessly curious about why. I'm endlessly curious about these experiences,
Uh-huh.
and enjoy them.
Maybe we can follow up. We have two more last questions, more general. Trying to figure out how to relate it to what we have been just discussing. But maybe it's interesting because we picked up on a reference you made in our last encounter in the winter school of the USP about Fanon, who says that there is no recuperation of some kind of black essence that comes before this. And we have been discussing very briefly only about current movements in the sense of what's moving people and intellectuals, thinkers, but also what's moving in a city like Sao Paulo, for instance, in cultural scenes. Moving in the sense of claims to ancestrality and claims to reparation that are being voiced and revoiced in different contexts. So the question is, what do you make of this? On the one hand, your reference to Fanon when you talk about like urbanities and that there is no return to this kind of black essence that comes before it, but at the same time, these claims in contemporary movements about ancestrality, about reparation, how would you navigate this?
No, I mean, I think that I think that the demand for, I mean, how do you, through what levers, for example, does Haiti have in terms of generating some kind of resource for itself? I mean, one of the most broken nations in the world, which at some point led the way in terms of what a nation could be. And how it has been systematically undermined through the incurrence of debt to French banks over a several hundred-year period, and the way in which legally there could be some ways to recuperate some kind of. So I think that, but it's a kind of I don't mind it. I see nothing wrong with it. But it is a kind of economistic language, and it is a kind of language that tries to prove itself eligible within the terms of a logic which was responsible for one's subjugation to begin with.
Mm.
So, yes, you can operate through the terms of whiteness as a way to make legitimate claims of ancestrality and what is due or not due in terms of those claims. But that does not, for me, is not. It's like Gödel's theorem between what is complete and what is comprehensive. Is not complete. It's not a completion of blackness. It doesn't mean that somehow there is a trajectory that will complete blackness, a kind of ancestrality finally liberated, finally able to authenticate itself in freedom and in abolition. Abolition means the getting rid of the entire system of accounting, the whole system of narration that generated the legitimacy of such claims to begin with. And I think that increasingly in the future, blackness will be about much more than simply those trajectories of ancestrality. Blackness will be a mode of existence that we don't yet have the terms for recognizing, because it will be constituted through the operations of multiple technicities, which will have operations of their own, which will generate dispositions that we might see homologous philosophically to a sort of Fanonian understanding of blackness, but which will take us far from the populations that we attribute blackness to at the moment.
Yeah.
In time, and actually was a very nice
Was.
ending statement. So, and we are perfectly on time.
Yeah.
Perfectly.
Wow,
Okay.
that was really good.
Yeah, adorei.